scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening at the Pig family house when Peppa noticed something strange about her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The reflection smiled back at her, but Peppa wasn't smiling. She blinked, and for a moment the reflection didn't blink back. George was playing with his toy dinosaur in the living room when he heard whispers coming from the walls. The whispers spoke in a language he couldn't understand, but somehow he knew they were calling his name. Mummy Pig was preparing dinner in the kitchen when all the family photos on the wall began to change. In each picture, the family's smiles became wider and wider, stretching beyond what should be possible. Their eyes grew darker, like empty holes staring back at her. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper in his favorite chair when the words on the pages started rearranging themselves, spelling out messages that made no sense, yet filled him with inexplicable dread. That night, Peppa couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear footsteps in the hallway. But when she looked, no one was there. The footsteps were small, like a child's, but they moved in a rhythm that didn't match any normal walking pattern. George's room was across the hall, and she could see his door was slightly open. Through the crack, she glimpsed something moving in the darkness that was too tall to be George. The next morning, the family gathered for breakfast, but something was wrong with their shadows. While they sat at the table eating, their shadows on the wall were standing up, moving independently, reaching toward each other with elongated arms. Peppa tried to tell her parents, but when she spoke, her voice came out as someone else's whisper. At Playgroup, Susie Sheep noticed that Peppa's eyes had changed color overnight. They were still brown, but there was something else behind them, something that watched and waited. During playtime, all the toys in the room began moving on their own, arranging themselves in perfect circles around the children. The teacher, Madame Gazelle, smiled her usual smile, but her reflection in the window showed something entirely different. When the family returned home that evening, they found that their house had gained an extra room. A door that had never been there before stood at the end of the upstairs hallway. Behind the door, they could hear the sound of children playing, but the voices didn't belong to Peppa or George. The voices belonged to children who sounded exactly like them, but spoke words they had never said. As night fell, the Pig family realized they were no longer alone in their house. There were others now, others who looked just like them, but weren't quite right. These others lived in the mirrors, in the shadows, in the spaces between the walls. And slowly, very slowly, they were beginning to take over, one reflection at a time.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across her pink walls. As she got dressed, Peppa noticed her reflection in the mirror was moving just a fraction of a second too late, as if it was trying to catch up with her movements. Downstairs in the kitchen, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her usual cheerful humming had been replaced by an eerie silence. When Peppa looked closely, she saw that Mummy Pig's eyes had turned completely black, like two dark holes in her face. Yet Mummy Pig continued cooking as if nothing had changed, her movements mechanical and precise. George was sitting at the breakfast table, but he wasn't playing with his toy dinosaur as usual. Instead, he was staring directly at Peppa with an unsettling grin that stretched far too wide across his face. His teeth, normally small and harmless, had become sharp and pointed like tiny daggers. The family car ride to Playgroup felt endless. Daddy Pig drove in complete silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Through the car windows, Peppa could see that all the other houses in their neighborhood had their curtains drawn shut, and no other cars were on the road. When they arrived at the Playgroup, the building looked exactly the same from the outside, but something was terribly wrong. The playground was empty, and the swings moved back and forth in the windless air as if invisible children were playing on them. The slide that was usually bright yellow had faded to a sickly pale color. Inside the classroom, all of Peppa's friends were already seated in a perfect circle. Susie Sheep, Rebecca Rabbit, Pedro Pony, and all the others sat motionless with their backs straight and their hands folded neatly in their laps. Their eyes had the same black emptiness that Peppa had seen in Mummy Pig's face. Madame Gazelle stood at the front of the classroom, but her usual warm smile had been replaced by something cold and calculating. When she spoke, her voice echoed strangely, as if it was coming from somewhere far away. She announced that today they would be playing a very special game, one that had never been played before. The game was simple, Madame Gazelle explained. Each child would take turns standing in the center of the circle while the others watched in complete silence. But as each friend took their turn, something horrible happened. They would stand up normally, but then their bodies would begin to change, stretching and twisting into impossible shapes. Peppa watched in horror as Susie Sheep's wool began to fall out in clumps, revealing gray, mottled skin underneath. Rebecca Rabbit's ears grew longer and longer until they dragged on the floor behind her. Pedro Pony's mane turned from brown to black and began to move like it was alive, writhing and reaching toward the other children. When it was finally Peppa's turn to stand in the center, she felt a strange tingling sensation spreading through her body. She looked down at her hands and saw that her pink skin was becoming translucent, and she could see dark veins pulsing underneath. Her red dress began to change color, shifting from bright red to deep crimson to black. The other children began to chant in unison, their voices creating a low, hypnotic hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the classroom. The words they spoke were in no language Peppa had ever heard, but somehow she understood their meaning. They were calling to something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting for a very long time. As the chanting grew louder, the classroom began to change around them. The cheerful yellow walls darkened to a deep purple, and the windows became black as night. The toys and books that lined the shelves began to move on their own, rearranging themselves into strange patterns and symbols. Peppa tried to run toward the door, but her legs wouldn't obey her commands. She was trapped in the center of the circle, unable to move as the transformation continued. Her reflection in the classroom mirror showed something that was no longer quite Peppa, but something else entirely, something with too many teeth and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. The episode ended with Peppa's family driving home in the same eerie silence. But now Peppa sat in the back seat with the same black eyes and mechanical movements as the rest of her family. The car passed by other houses where other families were returning from their own strange days. All of them changed, all of them part of something larger and more terrifying than anyone could imagine. As they pulled into their driveway, Peppa looked up at her bedroom window and saw another version of herself looking back down, the version that had never left the house, the version that was still normal. But as she watched, that other Peppa slowly raised her hand and waved goodbye before the curtains closed forever.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a rainy evening when Peppa and George discovered something strange in their attic. While playing hide-and-seek, George found an old wooden box covered in cobwebs. When they opened it together, they found old family photographs that looked exactly like theirs, but something was terribly wrong. In these photographs, their family looked the same, but their eyes were completely black, like empty holes. The house looked identical to theirs, but the windows were boarded up and the garden was dead. Most disturbing of all, there was an extra family member in every photo. A tall, thin figure standing behind them with a wide, unnatural smile. Peppa tried to show the photographs to Mummy Pig, but when she looked at them, they appeared completely normal. The same happened with Daddy Pig. Only Peppa and George could see the dark eyes and the mysterious figure lurking in the background. That night, Peppa heard strange scratching sounds coming from inside the walls. She woke George, and together they followed the sounds through the house. The scratching led them to the living room, where they discovered that all the family portraits on the walls had changed. Their faces in the pictures now had the same black, empty eyes. The scratching grew louder and seemed to be coming from behind the largest family portrait above the fireplace. As they watched in horror, the frame began to bulge outward. The glass cracked with a sharp sound that echoed through the silent house. Suddenly, a long, pale hand emerged from the portrait, followed by the tall figure from the photographs. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like a broken puppet. Its smile was impossibly wide, and its black eyes seemed to absorb all the light in the room. The figure spoke in a voice that sounded like their own voices mixed together. It told them that it had been waiting in the photographs for so long, watching their family, and now it wanted to take their place. Every night, it would replace one family member in the photographs, and eventually, it would replace them in real life too. Peppa grabbed George's hand, and they ran upstairs, but when they reached their bedroom, they found that all their toys had changed. Their teddy bears now had the same black eyes, and their blocks had formed strange patterns on the floor that filled them with dread. The figure appeared in their doorway, its smile even wider than before. It began to change shape, sometimes looking like Mummy Pig, sometimes like Daddy Pig, but always with those terrible black eyes. It told them that soon, everyone would have black eyes. As the figure reached toward them, Peppa noticed that their own reflections in the bedroom mirror were beginning to change. Their eyes were slowly turning dark. The figure laughed and told them that soon they would join the family in the photographs, trapped forever behind the glass.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning in Peppa's house, or so it seemed. Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window had an unusual pale quality, and the familiar sounds of her family were strangely absent. She called out for Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig, but only silence answered her. Peppa made her way downstairs to the kitchen, where she expected to find her family having breakfast. Instead, she found the table set for 4, with steaming bowls of porridge that seemed to have been waiting for hours. The porridge was still warm, but there was no one around. The chairs were pulled out as if someone had just left, but the house felt completely empty. George appeared in the doorway, but he looked different. His usual cheerful expression was replaced by a blank stare, and when he spoke, his voice sounded hollow and distant. He told Peppa that Mummy and Daddy had gone to a special place, and that they would be joining them soon. When Peppa asked where this special place was, George simply smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The telephone rang, breaking the eerie silence. Peppa answered it, hoping to hear a familiar voice, but instead heard only static mixed with what sounded like whispers. The whispers seemed to be calling her name, but they came from voices she didn't recognize. The phone line crackled, and through the static, she could make out words about a gathering, about everyone coming together, about no one being left behind. Peppa decided to visit her friends to see if they knew what was happening. She walked to Susie Sheep's house, but when she knocked on the door, it creaked open by itself. Inside, she found Susie sitting in her living room, staring at a television that showed only static. Susie turned to look at Peppa, and her eyes seemed to reflect the static from the screen. She spoke in a monotone voice, telling Peppa that the program was about to begin, and that everyone needed to watch. At Rebecca Rabbit's house, the same scene repeated. Rebecca sat motionless in front of a static-filled television, her usual energetic personality completely gone. She told Peppa that the special broadcast would explain everything, that soon everyone would understand their purpose. The static on the screen seemed to pulse with a rhythm that made Peppa feel dizzy and confused. Pedro Pony's house was no different. Pedro sat in his chair, eyes fixed on the flickering screen, speaking in the same hollow tone about the importance of watching, of listening, of becoming part of something bigger. Each friend Peppa visited had the same vacant expression, the same obsession with the mysterious broadcast that seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. As evening approached, Peppa found herself back at home, where George was still waiting with that unsettling smile. He led her to the living room, where their television was now showing the same static as all the others. George told her that Mummy and Daddy were already part of the broadcast, that they were waiting inside the screen for Peppa and George to join them. The static began to clear, and Peppa could see shadowy figures moving within the screen. They looked familiar, but their movements were wrong, too slow and deliberate. George reached for Peppa's hand and told her it was time to step through, time to become part of the program that would never end. The figures in the screen turned toward them, and Peppa realized with growing horror that they had the faces of everyone she knew, but their eyes were empty, reflecting only the endless static. The screen began to glow brighter, and Peppa felt herself being pulled toward it. George's grip on her hand tightened, and his smile grew wider, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. The voices from the television grew louder, calling her name, promising that she would never be alone again, that she would always be part of the show. As the light from the screen enveloped her, Peppa's last thought was that the program was just beginning, and it would never, ever end. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening at the Pig family house when Peppa and George discovered something strange in their bedroom. The toys they had left scattered on the floor were now arranged in a perfect circle, all facing the center where their favorite teddy bear sat motionless. Peppa thought it was odd, but George just giggled and ran to play with his dinosaur. That night, as the family slept peacefully, the toys began to move on their own. The teddy bear's button eyes started glowing with an eerie red light, and it slowly turned its head toward the sleeping children. One by one, the other toys joined in, creating a silent parade around the room. The toy car rolled without being pushed, and the wooden blocks spelled out words that no child should ever read. When morning came, Peppa woke up to find all her toys staring directly at her bed. Their usual cheerful expressions had changed into something much more sinister. The teddy bear's smile had become a twisted grin, showing tiny sharp teeth that definitely weren't there before. George's dinosaur toy had grown real claws, and its plastic eyes had turned completely black. Peppa tried to tell Mummy and Daddy Pig about the strange behavior of their toys, but every time she spoke, the toys would return to their normal positions. Her parents thought she was just having bad dreams. But Peppa knew something was terribly wrong when she noticed that the toys were following her with their eyes wherever she went in the house. During breakfast, the family sat around their usual table in the bright yellow kitchen. Everything seemed normal until Peppa looked down at her plate and saw that her food had arranged itself into the same circle pattern as the toys. George started crying when his juice box began pouring itself, creating strange symbols on the table. The house began to change around them. The cheerful yellow walls started to fade to a sickly green color, and the windows showed not the sunny garden outside, but a dark forest filled with twisted trees and glowing eyes. The family portraits on the walls began to move, showing the Pig family with increasingly frightened expressions. As the day progressed, more toys from around the house joined the strange gathering. Old dolls with cracked faces and stuffed animals with patches of fur missing all assembled in the growing circle. The toys began to whisper among themselves in voices too quiet for human ears, but Peppa could somehow understand every word. That evening, the toys made their final move. They surrounded the entire family in the living room, their eyes glowing brighter than ever before. The teddy bear stepped forward and spoke in a voice that sounded like rustling leaves, explaining that they needed the family's help to return to the world of the living. But just as the situation seemed hopeless, Peppa remembered something her grandmother had told her about the power of love and imagination. She closed her eyes tightly and began to think of all the happy times she had shared with her toys, all the adventures they had been on together. Slowly, the toys began to remember too. Their angry expressions softened as they recalled the gentle hands that had played with them and the comfort they had provided during scary nights. The red glow in their eyes faded, replaced by the warm light of cherished memories, and everything returned to normal.